Hey there, hope you're doing good. Cloud costs are significant. I have seen startups that are so small they have only one backend engineer get a cloud bill of 10,000 or 20, even $20,000 a month. And I have seen bigger companies like a Series C startup get a cloud bill of more than 100K dollars a month. This naturally causes a lot of problems for companies. How do you think about cloud cost reduction? The first thing you need to realize is it's a project. You need to spend time and money to save money. It's like buying a fuel efficient car. Let's say you observe that you are spending a lot of money on fuel for your car, and you say, let me buy a fuel efficient car. Well, you have to spend a huge amount of money upfront. Only later will you get savings, and there will be a payback time. In the short term, it may be cheaper to stick with your inefficient car. So there's no free lunch. It's not like you just flip a switch. In this case, reducing cloud costs is a project in itself. You need to understand all the tools, the options, good practices, how they are implemented in a particular cloud like AWS and so on. When you ask people to reduce cloud costs, it takes their focus away from whatever they were working on. Don't flip flop. If you do, nothing gets done. I know one startup that was focused on improving reliability. And then suddenly a big cloud bill came, and the founder panicked and called a Sunday morning meeting and said, we need to reduce costs. And he became very agitated and so on. Okay. The reliability project was put on hold. After 3 weeks of working on cloud cost reduction, he asked about the reliability project. Well, there was no progress since it was put on hold. He said we need to work on reliability. And it was pointed out to him that we agreed to work on something else. So then we put the cost reduction on hold and worked on reliability. So we lost a month or so of time in this process. So don't flip flop. Treat it as a project. Don't treat it as just some hack to do to reduce costs. Prioritize it. Look at the opportunity cost. If we do this, what are we not doing? Make a considered decision and put it in writing in a spreadsheet or pen and paper or whatever list tool you use like Trello. Let's look at some specific suggestions now. The first is to use newer generations like M5 instead of M4. You get more for the same cost, more performance, or the same performance for lower cost. Either way, there's no reason to stick with an older instance. It's like using an older laptop. But even better, you're not paying upfront. So if you want to upgrade your laptop, you have to pay upfront. In this case, it's not like that. You're renting it by the hour. So you might as well rent the newer one if you can get it for the same price. Try different architecture options. AWS uses Graviton 2 processors, which are the most cost efficient. If not, try AMD. Go with Intel as the last option. In particular, most software should work on AMD just fine since it's compatible with Intel. The next tip is to adjust the cost of CPU to memory. You can get instance types with different ratios. Taking AWS as an example, you can get a compute optimized instance with a 1:2 ratio. A default type with 1:4 ratio, which means for each CPU you have 4 GB memory. A memory optimized, which are in the R series of 8 and 16 as well. So here if you look at the ratio, This C series is compute optimized. So you get 2 GB per core. On the other hand, the default type, which is the M series, gives you 4 GB memory for one core. The R series, which is memory optimized, gives you 8 GB for one core. And X2GD gives you 16 GB per core. With Google, you can even go down to 1 to 1. So that's Google's compute optimized. So point is, you get different ratios depending on whether your workload is CPU bound or memory bound. For example, databases are memory bound typically. So you should prioritize spending on memory than CPU. So don't blindly reduce the instance size to save costs. Find out which resource, CPU or memory, is being underutilized and reduce that. If both are, reduce step by step. Don't make abrupt changes. So if you're going to reduce from, let's say, m6g.large, which is row 11, to m6g.medium, which is row 7, you're reducing the CPU from 2 to 1, you're reducing the memory from 8 to 4. Do it in stages. First, reduce the CPU to 1 by switching to R6G.medium. That itself will give you a little cost reduction. Then after it has worked fine for a couple of weeks, reduce memory. Or to take a different example, if you're reducing from 32 to 8 GB memory, reduce it to 16 GB, run it for a few weeks, then reduce it to 8. Don't make abrupt changes. Look at the graphs to find out which is the contender risk, which is the bottleneck, and adjust that. Don't blindly make changes. And if you're not sure which one to reduce first, try reducing the CPU. Reducing the memory can cause an outage because the minute the memory consumption exceeds the limit, it will crash. CPU is not like that, it will just slow down. And you can see how far you can play the game. Maybe your latency increases little bit as you reduce the CPU, and maybe that's still good enough for you. So CPU is safer to decrease. Moving on, enable auto scaling. If you're using a serverless platform, you get this automatically, be it functions as a service like Google Cloud Functions or AWS Lambda or Google App Engine. In particular, look at scaling down in off-peak times. And don't set up a time-based rule like after 9 p.m. reduce the instance size, instance count. Don't do that. Make it based on the traffic. If you're using database read replicas, reconsider them to save costs. Given the complexity of the cloud, you need to make a spreadsheet like this to look at various options. You can consider using Linode, which can be much cheaper. For example, I've compared VMs of different types and notice that it's 34 for Linode compared to at least double on other platforms or even triple. A VM with 16 GB memory, the cost changes from $61 to $3. Object storage, hundreds of dollars with Google or Amazon to $5 with Linode. The problem with Linode is you lose the higher level abstractions like serverless. Tools like Google App Engine are very powerful. You don't want to lose them because then you're not saving cost. You're replacing one cost with another cost. You're replacing the cost of cloud with the cost of development, and that's worse at an initial stage. At a scaled company, if Amazon saves 5% of their hosting costs, that's important. It's millions of dollars. So it makes sense for Amazon to pay an engineer a whole year, let's say, to save $1 million because his salary is much less than $1 million. It does not make sense for a startup to pay somebody, I don't know, let's say $80K to reduce the costs by $2,000 a month. That's $24,000 a year. Would you pay 80 to get to save 24? No, right? Doesn't make sense. And again, the cost of development as well. So it's a fixed cost. Think about it this way: if you drive a lot, it's worth investing in a fuel efficient car because the cost of the car is a one time purchase, whereas the cost of fuel is a repeating purchase. So, if the repeating thing becomes high, you should optimize for that. If it is low, you should optimize for the fixed cost. And also, if development is delayed, your startup will lose in the marketplace as compared to competitors. Startups are all about moving fast, even if it costs more money. And that's a business problem. And by the way, the investors will be expecting unrealistically fast growth. I mean, anyway, what they expect isn't reasonable, or what they have been promised. They have been sold the moon by the founders. So, anyway, you're starting off with an unrealistic expectation. On top of that, if you slow yourself down by not using productive but costly tools, you will fail. So, treat the cloud costs beyond a point as a business problem. Don't stop using managed services to save costs. That's penny wise and pound foolish for the reason we discussed. Don't use AWS savings plans or reserved instances or things like that. They lock you into specific services. For example, savings plans apply for only a few services like EC2 and Fargate and something else. You can't use that money for RDS. And what if you decide to move away from EC2 to some other service? Then you're in trouble. It's only for compute. Reserved instances are worse. You lock yourself into a region and a particular instance type. Like if you need 8 GB instead of 4 GB, then your reservation actually is wasted. And I've seen reserved instances sit idle. So actually, never trade away flexibility. You are paying for it in another way which you don't see. At least not at the time of making that decision, at least in the case of this company that bought the reserved instances. So don't trade away flexibility. One of the big advantages of the cloud is flexibility. Now, if you own your own hardware, that's a completely different cost calculation. There you are trading away flexibility, but you're getting a whole host of advantages like control and lower costs at scale and so on. But if you're using the cloud and trading away flexibility, that's the worst of both worlds. Don't use instance types not covered by the SLA. So RDS, for example, their smaller instances are not covered by the SLA. I think the micro or something. There are two of them, small. So it starts only with large, this table. Don't use burstable instance types. They cost more for the performance. In other words, they have poor performance to price ratio. Don't mess up your architecture to save costs. For example, if you have multiple customers with multiple instances of your architecture, don't make it heterogeneous. Try to standardize on things. Don't have a read replica for one customer and not for another. Just makes DevOps harder. If one of the customers is not paying enough to cover the cost of the infrastructure, that's a business problem. You should raise the minimum you charge each customer who has a dedicated instance. As another example, if you have 4 app servers and you notice that one of them is needing less CPU, don't decrease the CPU just for that instance, because that makes your architecture heterogeneous. Architecture should be based on principles, not hacks to save money. You can make changes as long as it doesn't violate the architecture. If you'd like me to optimize your cloud, my consulting link is in the description. Thank you.